Namo tassa, excuse me, Namo, sometimes I have, as I get the right rhythm, Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. That's the Sri Lankan way. It's not my special rhythm. Nam. Okay, never mind. Okay, so today we are taking Sutta number 111 in the Majjhima Nikāya. This is called Anupada Sutta. And it was translated the title was translated very freely by Venerable Nyanamoli as one by one as they occurred. I don't know his reason for translating the title in that way. Okay, this is a sutta which I have to say I suspect is a later addition to the Sutta Pitaka. And there are certain reasons for that, for making that assessment. One is that there's no counterpart to the sutta in the Chinese agamas, which usually have translations of almost all the suttas in the Majjhima Nikāya. And there's no other parallel to the sutta in any other collection of literature from the early Buddhist schools. And also the sutta uses some terminology which in Pāli seems to be a little bit later from the period of the very early discourses. It seems that we're moving in this sutta towards somewhat more technical treatment of the teaching. In fact, I see this sutta to be almost a transitional teaching between the old stratum of the Sutta Pitaka and the style of analysis and elaboration that will become crystallized in the Abhidharma systems. And it's also significant that the sutta centers around praise of Venerable Sāriputta and an explanation of Venerable Sāriputta's path to enlightenment, the way in which he contemplated in order to reach the final realization of the teaching. And some of you may know that Sāriputta is credited as being, in a sense, the father of the Abhidharma system, even though most schools ascribe the Abhidharma to the Buddha himself, but they consider Sāriputta to be the one who sort of organized and elaborated the Abhidharma. And we can see in this sutta some features of analysis that will become even more refined, more elaborate in the Abhidharma. Okay, so turning to the text of the sutta, you can see that the sutta is actually ascribed to the Buddha himself, since it's said that it occurs when the Buddha was living in Savatthi at Jeta's Grove, and it's given as an address by the Buddha to the monks. And it begins with the Buddha praising Sāriputta. And so maybe first we should explain, for some people who are fairly new to the Dhamma, who was Venerable Sāriputta? Now, it's said that all of the Buddhas have two chief disciples. And so our Buddha, the Buddha Gautama or Shakyamuni Buddha, also had two chief disciples. And those two chief disciples were Sāriputta and Moggallana. Moggallana specialized in what we would call miraculous powers, supernormal powers, psychic powers, the ability to multiply his body, to travel through space, to dive in water, to pass through walls, to make his body larger, smaller, and so on. And Sāriputta's specialization was in wisdom, insight, or deep understanding of the Dhamma. Sāriputta and Moggallana, even before they encountered the Buddha, they had been friends from boyhood. They had been very close friends. And then when they reached maturity, they both decided at just about the same time to go seek a path to enlightenment. They came from Brahmin families, but they became in an early age, disillusioned with their position of privilege, the easy life to which they had access. And they realized that as human beings, we all have to grow old, decrepit, die, and then take rebirth elsewhere. And so they thought, rather than just enjoy life, enjoy the wealth of our families, let us together seek a path to liberation. And so together they traveled all over India, seeking out different gurus or spiritual masters, until they came back to the state of Magadha, the city of Rajagaha, without really being satisfied with any teacher. Then they became pupils of one of the teachers who was living near Rajagaha, named Sanjaya. They weren't really satisfied with his teaching, but they just decided to accept him as their teacher. Then one day, when Sāriputta was traveling around, he saw a monk who was walking very calmly, very peacefully on alms round. And this monk was one of the first 5 disciples of the Buddha, named Assaji. And so as soon as Sāriputta saw him, he thought, that one knows. Because he could see from his manner, so calm, all of his movements, very mindful, very peaceful. He seemed to be fully aware of every step he was taking. So Sāriputta followed him till he saw that this monk, after completing his alms round, went off to take his meal. Sāriputta waited till he finished his meal. Then Sāriputta came up to him and said, "Who are you? Who is your teacher? What is the teaching that you follow?" And then this monk, Assaji, said to Sāriputta, he said, "My name is Assaji, and I'm a disciple of the prince of the Sakyan clan, who left the household life and became enlightened. And so now we call him the Buddha." And Sāriputta said, "What is the Buddha's teaching? What is the essence?" And Assaji said, the monk Assaji said, "I'm just," even though he was a fully enlightened arhat himself, but he said, "I'm just a student of the master. I can't really explain it in great detail." But Sāriputta said, "I don't need details. Just tell me the essence. Express it as clearly and concisely as you can." Then Assaji replied with just a verse of 4 lines. He said, "Whatever things there are that originate from a cause, the Enlightened One has explained the cause, and he's also explained what is their cessation." That is the teaching of the great ascetic. And as soon as Sāriputta heard this verse of 4 lines, there arose in him what is called the eye of Dhamma, the vision of the Dhamma. That is, his insight penetrated right through to the ultimate truth of the Buddha's teaching. And he became a stream enterer, that is, one on the first stage of enlightenment. Then, after reaching the first stage of enlightenment, he went to find his friend Moggallana and told him, "I found the path to liberation." And Moggallana said, "What is it? Tell me the essence." And Sāriputta told him about this meeting with the monk Assaji, and then Sāriputta repeated the same 4-line verse. And as soon as Moggallana heard the verse, boom, he also reached the first stage of enlightenment. And so then the 2 of them together, they knew that the Buddha was living in the bamboo grove, so the 2 of them came to see the Buddha at the bamboo grove. And as they were approaching, the Buddha was giving a discourse to the monks, and when the Buddha saw them coming in the distance, he told all of the monks, "Do you see that pair of young men who are coming here? Those will become my 2 chief disciples." And so the 2 young seekers came to the Buddha, bowed down to him, and asked to be admitted into the order of monks. And then the Buddha told them, "Come and live the spiritual life for the full liberation from suffering." And so in this way they were admitted into the order, into the Sangha. Then after their ordination, they received some further instruction from the Buddha. Then the 2 of them went off to practice in solitude. And Moggallana practiced very diligently for 1 week. And after 1 week, he achieved the final goal, arahantship. But Sāriputta had to practice longer. He had to practice diligently for 2 weeks to reach the final goal. And so maybe the question comes, if Sāriputta is the one who's foremost in wisdom, why did it take him 2 weeks to reach the final goal, where it only took Moggallana 1 week? Maybe to use an analogy, maybe it's like, okay, 2 boys go to college, and one of them is very clear about that he wants to go into business, and so he takes a quick course of maybe business management. He starts off, in the freshman year, taking economics, whatever he needs, statistics, mathematics, then goes into business courses, and so maybe 3-4 years, then he gets his bachelor's degree. But he has a very narrow focus. He just knows business administration. So he gets his degree. But the other student wants to become very widely learned. He doesn't want just a narrow specialization. So he has, a very wide range of interests. He wants to know everything about world history, philosophy, world literature. Maybe he wants to study several languages, French, German, Italian and Japanese, Chinese, and maybe dabble in a little sciences, some courses in physics, biology. So maybe it takes him 6 years to finish his bachelor's degree. But when he finishes, he'll have a much wider knowledge, and maybe on that basis he can go on for his master's degree and his PhD. And when he finishes his PhD with such a wide body of learning, he can get a job in McDonald's or Walmart, while his friend who gets the business degree becomes a millionaire at the age of 25. I'm only joking. Okay, but it said that Sāriputta, in order to become the one who's foremost in wisdom, had to explore and investigate a much wider range of phenomena and master many different areas of insight realization. Okay, so now this sutta is going to tell us the particular type of practice that Sāriputta undertook in order to achieve arahantship. And so the Buddha begins the sutta with praise of Sāriputta. So he starts by saying that Sāriputta is wise. Actually, the Pāli word is pandita, which is, if you know the Indian word pandit, which has become, it's acquired in modern English something of a derogatory connotation, like somebody who thinks he's very smart, or like the experts that you see on TV, the talking heads on the news programs. But originally in ancient India, the word pandita meant somebody who was very learned, erudite, and capable of making wise decisions. So Sāriputta is wise. He's somebody who has great wisdom, mahapanyo, somebody who has wide or vast wisdom, because he's comprehended a great number of subjects. Sāriputta has joyous wisdom, like when he's developing insight, he's experiencing these insights with joy and delight. Sāriputta has quick wisdom, java-panyo, speedy wisdom, rapid wisdom. That is, he comprehends very quickly. And Sāriputta has keen wisdom or sharp wisdom, tika-panyo. That is, he understands things very precisely, very clearly, very lucidly. And then Sāriputta has nibbedika-panyo, penetrative wisdom, that whatever he investigates, he pierces it through, penetrates it with his insight, with his wisdom. It's like his wisdom, if you present him with any subject, any field for investigation, it's like maybe like a tangled mass of bamboos. But Sāriputta uses his wisdom like a machete knife, just cutting right through that tangle of bamboos and cutting through and creating a clearing. So Sāriputta is able to penetrate any subject that he's investigating. And then the Buddha says, during half a month, Sāriputta gained insight into states one by one as they occurred. And when the Buddha is speaking about this half a month, he's referring to the 2 weeks in which Sāriputta practiced insight in order to reach the stage of arahantship. And the phrase that Venerable Nyanamoli had rendered insight into states one by one as they occurred. I'll write the Pāli for this expression on the board, and then I'll explain it directly off the Pāli. The expression is Anupada Dhamma Vipassana. Of course, now Vipassana means insight. Dhamma means, in this case, it means phenomena, the factors of experience, the factors of bodily and mental experience. And Anupada, this is a rather unusual term. Pada also means a state or a factor, and anu has the sense of according to. So literally it would be something like insight into dhammas, insight into phenomena, maybe according to the nature of the factors. I'm just sort of speculating or guessing the meaning of this term based on an analysis of each component of the expression. It's a term that I think occurs only in this sutta. And so it seems to be, one gets the impression that it's an experiment with a new term that just never caught on. But now the Buddha is going to explain how Sāriputta's insight into states one by one as they occurred. So he's going to explain this insight into states one by one as they occurred. And so from the explanation, we can get some idea of what is meant by this expression. And the basic scheme will be that Sāriputta entered into each of the higher meditative attainments, the 4 jhanas, then the formless attainments, then the 9th attainment, which is called the cessation of feeling and perception. And then he investigated each one in terms of its constituent factors. And so Sāriputta's mode of practice combines the 2 elements of Buddhist meditation, that is, calmness or tranquility, samatha, and insight, vipassana, or else we can call them combining the 2 components of samadhi or concentration and paññā or wisdom. And so those of you who have been studying Buddhism and practicing for some time, you know that there are 2 sort of wings of Buddhist meditation. So we call these serenity and insight. The practice of serenity involves choosing a single, usually very simple object, and then focusing the mind exclusively on that object until the mind settles upon that object and all other thoughts, distractions, the play of emotions subsides, and the mind can just settle into that object and become increasingly absorbed in it. As the mind becomes more and more absorbed in the object, then the various hindrances or mental obstructions subside. Usually the texts classify the obstructions to concentration in terms of the 5 hindrances. We have the hindrance of sensual desire, the hindrance of anger or ill will, the hindrance of dullness and drowsiness, the hindrance of restlessness and remorse, and then the hindrance of doubt. So the initial stage of practice along the road of serenity is to overcome the 5 hindrances, and this is done by keeping the mind focused upon a single, usually very simple object, like the in and out breathing, or sometimes a colored disc will be used, which they call the kasina object. So one just keeps the mind focused on that object until the play of wandering thoughts becomes, or distracted thoughts become stilled and subsides. But one is still using the factor of thought, which is called vitakka, applied thought, to keep the mind on the object. So if one is doing mindfulness of breathing, one is just aware, breathing in, breathing out, breathing in, breathing out. If one chooses, for example, the blue disc as the object of concentration, one will just be focusing on that disc, blue, blue, blue. Any other thoughts come to the mind, let them go, and just bring the mind back using that function of thought to direct the mind to the object, the in and out breath, the blue disc, or whatever other object one has chosen. Okay, so as one does this, over time the distracting thoughts subside, and then a particular type of mental image will appear representing the object, and one continues to focus on that image until at a certain point the mind becomes completely immersed in that object. And that first stage of a complete immersion in the object, where it seems that even the distinction between mind and object has sort of faded out, this is the first jhana, the first stage of meditative absorption. And now this stage is not particularly unique to the Buddha's teaching, but in any kind of meditation system, whether coming from other religions or even without any religious basis, where one just focuses upon a single simple object, it's possible for the mind to become so deeply absorbed, deeply focused upon that object, that the mind will move on to a different level of experience, from the level of our ordinary day-to-day sense-based experience to a level of experience where there's just no disturbance at all by any of the distracting thoughts, disturbing emotions. And so many practitioners from other systems take this state to be like a unification with the Absolute, or to be a state of unity with God, or the realization of the ultimate. But what the Buddha teaches, is that this state of mental absorption is just a state of mind, a state of consciousness, which has been brought into being through effort, diligent practice. It's a state of mind that is constructed by volition. And if one examines that state of mind, one turns the mind back on that state and investigates it, one sees that it is constituted of a constellation, a multitude of distinct mental factors. And so this is what Sāriputta did in his practice of the jhana. That is, he first attained through the practice of samatha, serenity meditation, concentration. Through that practice, he attained the first jhana, and then he turned the mind back on that jhana, sort of reflectively examining it. And that marked the beginning of vipassana, of insight, gaining insight into the nature of this experience. Okay, so the text tells us that Sāriputta, quite secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unwholesome mental states, entered upon and abided in the first jhana, which is accompanied by applied and sustained thought with rapture and pleasure born of seclusion. So this describes that state of jhana itself. And in that state of jhana, you could see we have 4 factors mentioned in this description. There is the applied thought, that is the vitakka, which directs the mind onto the object. There's something called sustained thought, which keeps the mind anchored on the object, or metaphorically rubbing the object, or which keeps the mind anchored on the object. And then that experience of jhana is very joyful, ecstatic. So it's said to have rapture, and it's accompanied by a very blissful feeling, very pleasant feeling, which is called sukha, pleasure, or perhaps even better would be bliss, rapture and bliss born of seclusion. Okay, so that is a description of the jhanic state itself. But now the Buddha is going to go on to explain what Sāriputta did when he attained the jhana. He says that the states in the first jhana I'm going to skip over the states now. We just jump down to these states were defined by him one by one as they occurred. And now, what are the states that Sāriputta saw within the first jhana? And here we have a listing of the different mental factors that occurred within that experience. First, we have a listing of the 5 primary factors within the jhanic state. There is applied thought, that is the mental factor that has the function of directing the mind onto the object, or applying the mind to the object. And then we have vichara, translated here as sustained thought, but maybe I would use now examination. That is the factor that is looking at the object or examining the object. Then we have the rapture, because it's a very joyful or ecstatic experience, the pleasure or bliss, and the unification of mind, because the mind is just one-pointedly fixed upon that object. Then Sāriputta examined in more detail, and he saw 5 factors present in that experience. First, there is contact, since within the jhana, what is taking place is a contact between mind and the object. And so it's a very subtle process or act by which the mind is touching the object. In fact, contact is present with every experience that we undergo. Like when I'm sitting out here looking at you, then my mind is making contact with this whole visual field of people sitting at seats with tables in front of them. So in order for seeing to take place, there has to be the contact between mind and the object. If I'm going to be, say I have a red kasina, so I'm not looking at multiple objects, but I'm just focusing the mind on the red circle. Even to the point where I become fully absorbed in that. But still the mind is touching that red circle. So that mental touching is contact. Then there is a feeling. In this case, it's that blissful feeling or pleasant feeling. There is a perception. One is perceiving the object. If one is looking at, say, a classroom of other people, one is perceiving the classroom. At times, perception will have different focal points. So now I'll be focusing maybe Venerable Sagara Kantu, then I might look out in the back, Kaidi, Kaidi. I always get Kaidi, Kaidi mixed up. And maybe I look in the front again, I see Johnny. Okay, so different perceptions, different people, but on any occasion there's some perception. And perception, feeling, contact, they all work together, but they're distinct factors. And then there is some volition or intention. So here on any occasion of experience, there is some volition, some intention. So now, when I'm speaking, every sentence that I say, that I speak, there has to be some intention to speak that sentence. Otherwise, if I let all intentions to speak drop away, but then I have the intention to sit quietly in my seat. But then everybody will get angry with me and complain that we came to this class and Bhante just sat in the seat quietly. So I have to stir up the intention to speak. Okay, but even in the jhanic state, in every jhanic state, from the first all the ways up to the last, there's some intention, some volition, the volition to be in that jhanic state. And then, of course, there is the citta, that is, mind or consciousness. And then there are some other mental factors that are present. So we have here mentioned, these English translations, not perfectly satisfactory. Zeal, or I would render this as chanda, desire, like desire to be in the jhanic state. This is not craving, it's not attachment, but it's just to do any action, one has to have some desire to perform that action. So even to be in the jhanic state, even to higher jhanic states, there has to be some desire to be in that state. So that is what's translated here as zeal. Some decision, adhimokkha, or resolution to be in that state. Then there is energy, which is empowering the state. There is mindfulness, because mindfulness plays an instrumental role through the whole process of meditative development. Then there is equanimity here, which is not the equanimity of neutral feeling, but this is the equanimity of mental balance, because the mind is held, in order to enter the jhana, the mind has to be held in a very balanced state, not too much. The energy shouldn't be tend towards excitation or excitement, nor should the energy be too loose, too slack, but there has to be a balance in the level of energy, a balance in the effort. And so that balance of all of the factors is what is here called equanimity. And then there is attention, that is the factor by which the mind is turned to the object. So if some of you have studied the Abhidhamma, you could see here how this passage is similar to the way in the Abhidhamma text you take every state of consciousness and then break it down into its constituent factors. Okay, so here what Sāriputta has done is to take the jhana, it's a state of mental unification, but within that unification there is multiplicity, diversity, that is many mental factors working together. And what is the purpose, the function of seeing the jhana as a multiplicity of factors like this? What is the benefit?
You see it as a conditioned state, which is unsatisfactory.
Say again?
You see it as a conditioned state, which is unsatisfactory.
Okay, that's good. One sees it as a conditioned state. Any other aspect?
I think it makes one dispassionate about with one's attachment to the self, oneself.
Okay, yeah, that's good. I think there are two things that you indicated there. One is that it makes one dispassionate towards the factors themselves, and also it helps to sort of dissolve what you call identification with that experience as being a self. And so, one of the reasons that we grasp the idea of self, or the idea that there's a real I, a truly existing I, or in the Chinese, 我, or 善见, I think it's called, the view of a truly existing self, identity view, is because we don't see, we have this perception of ourself as being a unity, some kind of self-subsistent whole. But when we look at our experience with the eye of wisdom, then we see what is going on at any time that we're aware. Even in our day-to-day life, there's a whole bunch of different factors working together. There is feeling, perception, volition, and consciousness working together. Okay, so that we could see that in our ordinary experience, but also at these very elevated states of experience, the jhanic states. There's also a bundle of factors. And so when we see this experience as a bundle of factors which arise through various conditions and which just exist together through that experience, then it sort of breaks the self-identification with the experience. Okay, but now Sāriputta continues further with his investigation. He sees these states, Anupada Vipassana, Anupada Dhamma Vipassana, that is, he analyzes the experience into a bundle of mental factors, each with its own nature, and he defines them one by one. And then further it said, known to him those states arose, known they were present, known they disappeared. Maybe we should say, to use normal English word order, those states, he knew those states as they arose, he knew them as they were present, he knew them as they disappeared. And then he understood, so indeed these dhammas, these states, these phenomena, not having been before, come into being, and having been, having come into being, they vanish. So what is being indicated here by this passage? Exactly. Where did it come from? You said it? Okay. So this is the insight into impermanence. It's also called sometimes the insight into arising and passing away. Sometimes udaya bhaya. So before Sāriputta entered the jhana, those factors of jhana were not present. He enters the jhana, all of those factors come into being. While he's present in the jhana, those factors continue. When he emerges from the jhana, those factors come to an end. So he's seeing now impermanence, arising persisting for some time, passing away. And in fact, even within the jhana, what is actually taking place at a micro level is a succession of individual states of consciousness or individual frames of consciousness. It's just like maybe watching a movie. You know, when we watch the movie, we see the cowboy gets on his horse and goes riding into the sunset, and it looks like, you know, the same cowboy on the same horse riding into the same sunset. But if we get curious and we go back into the projector room, and we take the film and unroll the film, and what was that cowboy movie we were watching, we see that it's really a succession of frames. You know, in one frame the cowboy is here, next frame he's here, next frame he's here, next frame the leg is lifting, next frame the leg is in the spur of the horse. And then we see a whole series of frames where the horse is going boop, 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 boop. But then when we put it onto the projector and get it rolling, then it looks like the same cowboy on the same horse riding into the same sunset. And so when looks with insight into the experience even of the jhana, one sees it's a series of different acts of consciousness going very, very quickly. And so one gets the impression that it's just one continuous experience. But because Sāriputta had very, very sharp wisdom, he was able to sort of put his mind into the divisions between the different cittas making up the jhanic experience, and see how each one arises, stands, and passes away. And so he gets this insight. He understood thus: these states not having been, come into being, having been, they vanish. Then regarding these states, he abided unattracted or unattached by craving or attachment to them, and unrepelled by them, even though they were impermanent, but he didn't feel angry or upset by them. He dwelt independent, detached, free, dissociated, with the mind rid of barriers. And then he understood that there is an escape or a release beyond. In other words, he understood that even this first jhana, which is so joyful, so blissful, so relatively peaceful, is not the final stage. And so now he understands that there is some superior state beyond that. And then he continued his practice in order to achieve the state beyond that. At this point, I'll ask whether there's any questions. So this takes care of the first Sāriputta's practice with regard to the first jhanic state. Okay, this gentleman in the middle, and then maybe.
Could you repeat about the Udaya
Use the microphone.
Could you please repeat what you were saying about the Udaya and Samudaya?
Yeah, these terms mean Udaya or Samudaya means arising, origination, and Vaya means vanishing, disappearance. So those are the two primary stages that mark impermanence. that what hasn't existed before comes into being, then it persists for a little while, then it vanishes. And so when one sees arising, vanishing, that becomes the insight into impermanence. Okay, this gentleman with a blue coat.
Is there an intention in this teaching to inspire the listener to enter into these states by knowing the factors involved, inspiring the listener to try to bring these factors to bear in their own consciousness in an effort to enter into the jhanic state? Is there that intention?
I say that of course that's definitely the case, but I think it also shows not simply to inspire one to enter into the state, but also how one contemplates that state with insight in order not to be sort of swept away by misinterpretations of that state. Wait, take the microphone. Johnny? First row. Here. Please, you can take the microphone. Do you know? Yeah.
Thank you for explaining the process whereby Sāriputta entered into the jhanic state. I was wondering if you could add a little bit more regarding the focusing on the object, becoming immersed in the object, and then transitioning to the next stage where insight can occur. If you can please just expand a little.
More on focusing on the object?
Yes. How do you transition from focusing on the object to the point where further understanding can appear other than just looking at the object?
Okay.
I don't know if...
Okay, I think I get... So how does one make the transition from the stage of simple, let's call it simple one-pointed focusing on the object to the investigation with insight?
Right. How does one access more information?
Okay. Okay, here we get into a little bit of a controversial area. I'm not so sure whether I should go into this. Okay, I'll explain according to the mainstream way of understanding. Now, within the jhana itself, one cannot actually investigate the factors individually. This has to be done by emerging from the jhana, so that the mind is not completely absorbed in the object, but one is still, we'd say, basking in the afterglow of the jhana. In other words, the mind is still very concentrated, but now it's able to use the factors of investigation, of examination more effectively, because in the jhana, the mind is just completely absorbed on the object. The mind is completely focused on the object. And so one is undergoing the experience, but one is not able to investigate or distinguish its aspect. So one emerges from it, but with the mind still very calm, very settled, very very wieldy, so that one could use the mind according to one's wish. And then one looks back at that experience and one investigates what was present in that experience. And generally what I find to be the easiest way to analyze all of these factors can be rather difficult, but the way that's more sort of approachable is to take it in terms of the 5 aggregates, to take it in terms of, let's put the physical form aside, but in that experience one has a feeling, one had a feeling. So one knows one had the feeling of pleasant feeling, the blissful feeling. One knows that one was perceiving something within that experience. And so one can clearly, comprehend the object of one's perception, the act of perception. And one had the experience of the volition that was present. And so one can, or in the experience, volition was present. And so when one turns back on it, one can see that volition was present. And then one knows that consciousness, during that experience, one was conscious. And so one can reflect back on the consciousness that was present in that experience. And so in this way, one is examining the experience in terms of, now we have 4 of the aggregates, and now within the experience as well, the body was present. So that forms, that is the aggregate of bodily form. So in this way, one gets all 5 aggregates into that experience. And if one has a sort of more refined development of the jhana, then one can investigate it in terms of the jhana factors mentioned here. Even just taking the first 5, which are the applied thought, sustained thought, the joy, the blissful feeling, and the one-pointedness of mind. Okay, go away. Take the... Johnny has the microphone.
What you just explained was meant according to the mainstream of understanding, right?
Yeah.
But from the sutta itself, I really cannot see that Sāriputta emerged from the jhana in order to investigate all those factors. If we read the sentence, the mental factors or the states were defined by him one by one as they occurred.
Yeah.
So, and also the paragraph later on indicate that Sāriputta really emerged from the meditative state.
Yeah.
So, what I really like, because this issue has been confused me for a long time, what I really want to know from Bhante is just simply from the sutta itself, can you tell, just ignore the mainstream of understanding, but I think the mainstream of understanding comes from maybe Visuddhimagga, but my question is, according to the sutta itself, what would your comment be? This is the first question. The second is, does the position that one emerges from the jhana and then contemplate the states later on, as stated in the Visuddhimagga, had any sutta support? I'm sorry to ask these questions because it's been years, and because this is a very crucial point how one practices with the jhana. So I just like to know the answers to my 2 questions.
Buddha, will you answer? I have to say, when I was going to answer this lady's question, I said this is a rather controversial area. And I said I'd like to avoid that, and so I'll explain according to the mainstream. But now you've opened up the controversy. Yeah, okay, I know your point. it seems to me also that if one looks at the sutta on its own terms, it seems to be saying that the investigation takes place within the jhana itself. But one thing where Nyanamoli translates one, he defined it one by one as they occurred. Now in the Pāli, there's nothing that corresponds to the expression as they occurred. It's I wrote the word Anupada Dhamma Vipassana. It's insight into Dhammas. Anupada is rather obscure, according to the state. So one shouldn't be misled by that expression. Though I do admit, even if one takes out as they occurred, it seems to me that according to the text, Sāriputta is analyzing the jhana in terms of those factors within the jhanic experience itself. That's the way it seems, but I have to say, I don't see how it's possible, according to my understanding of jhana, to be undertaking an investigation like that while one is in the jhanic state. It may seem possible in the first jhana because applied thought and sustained thought is there. But say one comes to the fourth jhana, or the formless attainments, where we have the same expression here. So I will go along with, I have to go along with the commentary on this, that it seems to me to be correct. Did you want to add something to this, Katie?
Would that be acceptable to make a 3-point comment personally?
You have to turn it on, or?
So I was thinking 3 things. One, exactly was you were saying about fourth jhana. At a certain point, there's an experience that doesn't feel like there's agency there, personal agency. And at that moment, simultaneously, there can be insight, something experiential, but that doesn't have a component of agency, thinking or planning or investigating. And second, when that ceases, when the passing away occurs, it's incredibly natural for my agency, myself, my mind to come back and start asking very reasonable questions. What was that? What was that? And it, as I think you were saying, it will replay the experience or attempt to replay something that was experiential, but it will attempt to form an understanding of it. And I find that that's where the commentarial comes in, of trying to explain. And then third, I find the sincerity of always question about technique so wonderful and difficult. I think a lot of us, myself included, go through or experience that difficulty of which way is right, which way to do this, how to get this right. But I find personally that both explanations are correct, but the challenge of words in re-explaining something that is personal and interior, but not personal, kind of shared mental experience.
If there's comments further to this issue, rather than questions on another topic. Okay, I think Bowe wants to say something further.
I'm sorry, after this, I'll be again about this issue. Is it possible that sustained thought and applied thought in the second jhana just refer to the mind's the mental function in related to the meditation object?
In the first jhana, you mean?
In the second. Or even in the first or the
Because
second.
in the second jhana, there's no initial thought and sustained thought.
Yeah, so in the first jhana, and so it just refers to the meditation object only. So when in the second jhana, when a practitioner doesn't have sustained thought and applied thought that refers to the meditation object only, that means when his concentration, the level of his concentration has reached to that stage that no sustained thought or applied thought are needed anymore, but he is not, he still can have investigation into other factors. Is it possible that it's not possible to accept this kind of interpretation? So
yeah, I understand what you're saying. To myself, it doesn't seem possible.
It's not possible.
I didn't say it's not possible. I said to myself, it doesn't seem possible.
And the reason is?
Because it seems to me that to be able to distinguish the state into the factors and to know each factor, individually, requires a certain exercise in we call vitakka vichara, thought and examination, that wouldn't be possible in a state in which those are absent. That's the way I understand it. Okay, Dina, and
Hi.
Richard after.
It seems to me that by the time you're in the second jhana, it doesn't even occur to you to think about what's happening. It's just you're one with what's going on. So if you started to investigate and think about it, you'd no longer be there.
Yeah, that's the way it seems to me.
Yeah, it comes much after.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I was there.
Mm.
Yeah, there are three sets of terms that run through the whole thing, right? I mean, the first set, which in paragraph 4 is applied thought, sustained thought, rapture, pleasure, unification. That's the variable. Right? Those are the 5 variables, and they each jhana and each base state has a different combination of presence or absence of those. Now, contact, feeling, perception, volition, and mind is a constant. Those are the aggregates, right? Isn't contact the same as rupa?
No. Contact is not explicitly, in the suttas, contact is not explicitly included amongst any of the 5 aggregates.
It's not,
but it's in the Abhidhamma system, then contact gets put into the 4th aggregate, the aggregate of mental formations.
So then volition, is that mental formations?
Volition also is in mental formations, yeah.
So, but that's the set that's repeated through all 8, right? Why is that the set that's repeated, right, rather than the aggregates then? And why should, if contact and volition are duplication, like what's being left out and why is that being duplicated?
The first, contact and volition are not the same thing. I said that in the Abhidhamma, they're both put into the aggregate of mental formations, but they're 2 different factors. Okay, it seems to me, this is maybe another reason why I suspect the sutta being a little bit later. It seems that here a new way of looking at experience is being introduced to go along with this older scheme of the 5 aggregates. In this scheme, they're taking 5 factors which partly correspond, or mostly correspond to the aggregates, but we have here, but all of them in this scheme are mental factors. So we have contact, feeling, perception. Okay, so contact in the old aggregate scheme doesn't fit in. Then feeling, of course, is the same as the aggregate of feeling. Perception is the same as the aggregate of perception. Volition is the main factor in the aggregate of mental formations.
Yeah.
And then citta, or mind, comes to be identified with the aggregate of consciousness.
Yeah.
And so here we have 4 factors which correspond to 4 of the aggregates.
Yeah.
But the rupa, or form, is not mentioned in this scheme.
Yeah.
And now, in the suttas, contact is often mentioned, even though it's not assigned a distinct place in the 5 aggregates, but it's often mentioned as the condition for feeling, perception, and volition. And so contact, because it's mentioned so often in the suttas, it comes to be included in this scheme of 5 mental qualities.
Okay, but it isn't contact with rupa. That is, it's kind of like saying it's treating all of the senses as forms of touch. Right? It's like saying, okay, you see something, it's like, your eye is being touched by light from the thing.
Yeah.
Right?
It's using touch here metaphorically.
Yeah, okay, but the reason I was thinking that contact was associated with rupa is because it's contact. The contact is contact with rupa or by rupa, right?
For the most part, but not exclusively, because there's types of mental contact in which the mind is contacting, or the mind is cognizing a purely mental object. In that case, the mind is making contact with, say, an abstract idea. Say I have the idea of a unicorn. Okay.
An image, in that case.
Okay, that's maybe a bad example because it's based on a visual impression. The square root of 3. Square root of 5. Okay, so here the mind is making contact with a purely abstract object. So there is a contact there of mind with the object, though rupa is not directly present either in the faculty, which is mind, or the object, which is the abstract idea, square root of 5. Of course, rupa is present as the body, the physical body, but that is not directly engaged in the contact. So rupa, contact is not the same. Contact doesn't necessarily imply the presence of material form.
All right. Then is it an equivalent of the term intentionality?
Contact?
Yeah.
No. It's volition would be the equivalent of intentionality.
Well, no, I'm talking about in a phenomenological sense. That is, like Husserl, that is what he means by intentionality, and the whole the tradition of phenomenology and logic is
derived from Brentano. I would say that intentionality, in that sense, derives from the definition of any of the mental factors would be defined in terms of intentionality. Like perception, what is perception? It perceives. What does it perceive? It perceives red, white, blue, yellow, and so on. Volition, what is volition, or intention? What is volition? It wills, what does it will? It's volition in regard to form, sounds, odors, taste, tactile objects. Consciousness, what is consciousness? It cognizes. What does it cognize? It cognizes form, sounds, odors, taste, tactile objects. So I would say intentionality in the phenomenological sense is implied by the definition of each of these mental factors.
Each?
Yeah.
All right.
So all mental acts are intentional in that sense. that any mental factor is a mental function in regard to an object.
Okay. Last, you have this set: zeal, decision, energy, mindfulness, equanimity, and attention. That's a constant set. Those six are all essentially mental virtues, right?
Or mental qualities.
Qualities of concentration. And they're constant
Yeah.
through the whole thing. And what I'm wondering about them is, how come when you vary the elements of a jhana or a base, right, there's no variation in the mental qualities which are involved in putting one into that state. That is, those are constant in all 8 stages.
Okay, those are constant in all 8 stages, but let us say that they're constant in generic terms, in that they're in each one of those states, these factors will be represented, but the quality of the factors in the different attainments will be different according to the level of the attainment. In other words, I'll use this terminology: zeal, decision, energy, mindfulness, equanimity, and attention in the first jhana, in the second jhana will have a different quality than the zeal, decision, and so on in the first jhana. And similarly, when one goes to the third jhana, they become more subtle, more refined. The fourth jhana, still more subtle, more refined, and so on, all the way up to the final stage. At each level, these factors become subtler and more refined. So it's like, maybe to give an example, if we have a whole bunch of maybe caps like this of different shades of red, from this is a little bit burgundy color, could be a darker red, the bright red like your scarf, is that a scarf? Or sweater, up to Katie's shirt is almost getting to be a reddish orange. So we say that they're all red, but there are different shades of red. And so we could say that here there's different shades of zeal, decision, energy, mindfulness, equanimity, attention. They're all present, but different shades. Okay, well, this will be the last question.
In Digga 16, the Buddha recounted an experience, a deep meditative state when he did not hear or see raging storms, thunder and lightning. So I wonder what level of jhana you have to be in order to gain such deep concentration that you no longer hear or see, raging storms with thunder or lightning. Is the first jhana strong enough to
I think if there were raging storms and thunder, it would disrupt the first jhana. To know what state the Buddha was in at that time, I remember he says, but he was still percipient. So it was not the attainment of cessation of perception and feeling.
Yeah, he said,
it could have
although remaining conscious, he did not hear or see raging storms.
Yeah.
So he remained conscious.
Yes, the word used is sanyi, which is related to sanya, perception. So it's perception and consciousness, they go together.
So like fourth jhana?
The text itself doesn't specify, so one would just have to guess. Excuse me?
Does anyone online have questions, or is that opening a can of worms? Does anyone online have questions, or am I opening a
Oh, I see. There are people online.
Usually there are. But I don't have my computer and I apologize. I just sort of been something else I can't help.
There is a question online that's asking, is actually a statement and the question is first jhana may not be a prerequisite of stream enterer.
Okay, this is where I have my opinion. And I actually wrote a paper on this, which they could probably find on the internet. It's called Jhana and the Lay Buddhist. I think it's available online. And my impression from many descriptions of the lay Buddhists in the Pāli Canon is that they have reached the stage of stream entry, but they were not attainers of jhana. Or at least they were not, let's say didn't have mastery over the jhana, so that they could attain it at will. Maybe they attained it briefly before going into stream entry, but they were not like regular meditative masters of the jhana, so they could just sit down and enter it. Like we have Anathapindika, who was a businessman, Visakha, the laywoman who had many children, a household full of children, grandchildren. And yet they were able to become stream enterers through the power of insight, but one doesn't get the impression that they were jhana meditators. Okay, we could come back for further discussion since we have a little walk this time. Let's make it 12:20. So we could come back for maybe half an hour discussion. And then I thought I could take this whole sutta today. We'll continue this. We won't have the class next week because there is a meditation course going on from starting tonight until next December 1st, I think next Sunday. But we'll continue with the sutta the following Saturday. That will be December 7th? Okay, December 7th. Okay, so let us end with the sharing of the merits. I guess we don't have the sheets here, but if you know, you can recite along with me. Akasata Chabhumata Deva Naga Mahitika Punyantang Anumoditva Chirang Rakantu Sasanam Akasata Chabhumata Deva Naga Mahitika Punyantang Anumoditva Chirang Rakantu Desanam Akasata Chabhumata Deva Naga Mahitika Punyantang Anumoditva Chirang Rakantu Mang Parang Etavadacham Hehi Sampadang Punya Sampadang Sabbe Devanumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya Etavadacham Hehi Sampadang Punya Sampadang Sabbe Bhutanumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya Etavadacham Hehi Sampadang Punya Sampadang Sabbe Satanumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya Bhavagopadaya Vichihitato Etantare Satakayupapanna Rupya Rupicha Sanya Sanyino Dukkha Pamuchantu Pusantu Nibuting. Okay, we could end with 3 bows to the Buddha, or half bows to the Buddha, so we could stand.
About the Bhante.
Questions? You told me that the people who are coming in on the web, they also want to follow the discussion period?
Yes.
So now they're on?
Not everyone back yet. As of now, it's 5 people on right now.
Okay. Anyway, we can start. Yeah.
Bhante,
yeah.
I'm sorry to continue the topic. Just one more question.
Yeah.
If Bhante agrees, the reason that Bhante agrees with the mainstream of interpretation about to the practitioner emerges from the jhana to contemplate the states, it's mainly because of the vichara and vitakka, the sustained thought and applied thought, their absence in the second jhana, and there's no way to give it a reasonable interpretation.
Yeah.
If one has to emerge from if one can't investigate the states in the jhana itself, but the definition of vitakka and vichara as sustained thought and applied thought, as applied thought and sustained thought are not given in the sutta itself, right? The definition of those two words come from the later interpretation, like in the Abhidhamma literature, rather than the sutta itself, right? My point is, if we judge from the sutta itself, we cannot see that Sāriputta emerged from the jhana to contemplate.
That's right. Yeah.
But then we should not distort or the passage itself in order to fit a definition that is derived from not the sutta itself.
Yeah.
You know my point?
I get your point.
Okay.
I mean, what can I say?
Okay, so probably the definition of probably vitakka and vichara have to be redefined.
Well, actually, the way vitakka and vichara are usually used, apart from the context of jhana, their function of what we would call discursive thinking is much more evident. For example, it's said that anuvitaketi, anuvichareti, vachang bindati, having thought and examined, one breaks out into speech. Therefore, vitakka and vichara are called the conditions for speech, the conditioned activities for speech, or conditioning activities for speech. And then we get expressions like kama vitakka, vyapada vitakka, vihingsa vitakka. Here, vitakka as the thought of sensuality, the thought of ill will, thought of harming. So it's much more like ordinary thought. So and then there are numbers of other passages which use vitakka, vichara in ways that bring it much more close to ordinary thinking, discursive thinking. And so vitakka, vichara in the first jhana would be like the furthest refinement of vitakka, vichara, to the point where we wouldn't even think of them. We We wouldn't even consider them to be thinking in the ordinary sense of the word. So here the function of vitakka is just being reduced to like the bare minimum of directing the mind onto the object. And vichara is the bare minimum of inspecting, looking at, examining the object. And then in the second jhana and higher, they're gone. So as I said during the class, I just don't see how one could be sort of reflectively designating the different factors of experience and discursively considering now they're arising, now they're present, now they pass away, if vitakka and vichara are not present. But what I could see is that within the jhana, there'll be a very clear perception or cognition of the factors that are present, though one is not singling them out, but it's like a spotlight illuminating them, so that when one emerges from the jhana, then one can look back upon it and say, in that state, this was present, that was present, this was present, that was present. They didn't exist before, then they arose, then they passed away. Does that seem reasonable?
Because it's not, for me, it's difficult to believe that by contemplating something in the memory could help one, could make one breakthrough, to have the breakthrough.
I think Katie wants to say something.
I actually was going to ask about one of the translations as sustained thought, but I did want to say, if I may say experientially, that the insight simultaneously coming up with contact in a meditative absorption, something experiential occurs. Sort of like like if we say the equation 2 + 2 = 4, there's a little process that's happening to get to 4. But sometimes I would say experientially, insight seems to give all that information at once in a nonverbal, not necessarily logical sequence, but there's an understanding that comes up, and then as my agency arises back, a natural, calm, flexible mind comes in with agency to look at that insight that was sort of delivering a complete package. I'm not saying it's always this way, but sometimes the jhana is like a delivery of comprehensive experience, an experience that I'm not sure this is where I should take this conversation, but I was going to say experientially that it seems like insight to me delivers a full, complete experiential package that comes with understanding, hence the knowledge component. But then when the mind comes up, it still has pliability. My mind, when my agency comes up, it's very gentle, and then it can look back and we'll try to make a sequence of what happened and analyze it. And then finally I'll come out quite grossly. And I was just going to ask if sustained thought is still, when it comes to vitakka vichara, I know you've said vichara can be this type of investigation that's very fine. And so I was thinking, when you described it, I was thinking this is one reason I like the translation sustained thought, because now the mind has found its object and it's no longer wandering. It still needs a little help, so we're sustaining it there. And then eventually it sticks itself there. So is sustained thought still a translation you would accept of vichara?
I've used examination afterwards. But I have to point out, it's not examination in the sense of a discursive examination in order to understand the object, which would be leading into insight, into wisdom. But it's just, I don't know how to put this otherwise, but looking at the object. So vitakka applies the mind, that's the way it's explained, abhiniropana, lifting and putting the mind onto the object. And then vichara just continues to look at the object.
Yeah.
My memory for names is Ken, is that your name? Chris, okay, that's right.
Thank you. It sounds like in your description of vitakka and vichara, you're just referring to the redirection of one's attention.
To
the redirection of one's attention to the object.
Not the redirection of one's attention. That would be the function amongst the mental factors of attention.
Yeah, but your description sounds to me just like direction of one's attention to the object.
Yeah.
So is it different from that, or?
Well, what directs the attention to the object would be, in terms of mental factors, the one here called attention. This is manasikara.
Yeah. So how is vitakka and vichara different from directing and sustaining one's attention on the object? Yeah. I would say that, when it comes to just differentiating these subtle mental factors, it gets very difficult. But what I would say is that vitakka is what applies the mind to the object. So even when one has been observing the same object for some time, but it's vitakka which is constantly metaphorically lifting the mind and putting it onto the object. So for example, if one is take mindfulness of breathing. So I would say that it is vitakka which is constantly taking the mind, in a sense, and putting it on the breath. It would be attention which turns the mind to the breath, but then vitakka is applying the mind to the breath. Then vichara, you would say, well, vitakka is applying the mind, and it's something that's taking place repeatedly. It's not just that vitakka applies the mind and then drops away, but as one is, say, being mindful of breathing in, breathing out, vitakka is constantly putting the mind onto the breath, keeping the mind onto the breath, and then I'd say that it's vichara, which is looking at the function of the mind, looking at itself on the breath, to ensure that the mind is on the breath, and to be looking at the breath itself. That's the way I would just distinguish their functions. But I remember there was a book, it was an early translation of the Manual of Abhidhamma, Abhidhammata Sangaha, the one from the Pāli Text Society called Compendium of Philosophy. And there was an appendix to that by Mrs. Rhys Davids, or her co-translator, who was a Burmese, Aung Say something, a Burmese name. And they had also found a problem with differentiating vitakka, that's applied thought, from manasikara, from attention. And so they wrote to Lady Soyador, who was a famous Burmese, both scholar, monk, and meditation master, for him to clarify the difference. So, if you find a copy of that Compendium of Philosophy, I don't remember how he did it, but I remember that they bring up that question in the appendix on the distinction between vitakka and manasikara. So the two come very close together, so one needs a very sharp wisdom to be able to differentiate them. Maybe my wisdom is too blunt. Okay, I do have another question.
Yeah.
According to the suttas, is it necessary to have an object
to anchor one's mind to in order to enter jhana, like the breath or like a kasina? Or can one just kind of like let go into a jhanic state and maybe focus on the factors of the jhana itself?
I don't think focusing on the jhana factors would be the way to enter the jhana. But what I found is that there's ways to do meditation in which one is not, focusing upon a specific object, but just whatever comes in the mind, one just lets it go, lets it go, lets it go. Then the mind gets into a very serene, even concentrated state. So it seems almost like a jhanic state.
And then the jhana factors can naturally arise at that point, like
it would seem so.
Arise, yeah.
Now, technically, the mind would have to have an object in that case, since, according to, even the explanation we get in the Suttas, that consciousness always has an object. There's no such thing as an objectless consciousness. Mm-hmm. But it seems here that the mind doesn't have a single, specific object that it's focusing on. So maybe what I would say is that maybe the object in that case might be the luminosity of the mind itself. Okay. It seems that aspect of meditation maybe gets more emphasized or comes to more prominence within some of the Tibetan systems of meditation. Like from what I've heard, Mahamudra, maybe Dzogchen.
Thank you.
See you.
Thanks, Bhante. Bhante, in this description of the mental content that's present, or that was analyzed by Venerable Sāriputta, I remember even the panya, the wisdom, is a cetasika, mental.
Right. Yeah.
How come that's not?
How come that's not mentioned here?
Yeah.
Yeah, we have to remember that panya gets included as a mental factor when we have like the full-blown Abhidhamma system for analyzing a state of consciousness. Now here, in this sutta, it's, again, I have to say what seems to me to be the case, like this represents a transitional stage of development from the early layer of the suttas, where you have the jhana, what's mentioned as the jhana factors. In the early layer of the suttas would be just 5 factors: applied thought, sustained thought, rapture, blissful feeling, and one-pointedness of mind. So now it's evolving into a more complex understanding of the jhanic state by including this group of 5 factors, beginning with contact, and then adding some other factors, zeal, energy, mindfulness, equanimity, attention. So it's evolving in that direction. But probably it took, maybe a few more generations when, the Buddhist thinkers were then trying to consider what are all of the factors present in the first jhana. And then they would come to the decision, well, there has to be some kind of wisdom there. And so we put that in.
The other question is, it seems like here what's been really described is how Venerable Sāriputta actually penetrated the jhana itself by looking at it, dividing it. But in order to do that, Venerable Sāriputta was able to kind of, as you said, turn back and see the mind itself that's been observing this jhana state. Or rather, the mind itself, he's able to turn back. And when he turns back, actually he sees, I don't know how come it was not emphasized, but he sees that it arises and passing away, and he realizes that whatever arises, they pass away, they vanish.
Yeah.
Now, that seems to me like a higher wisdom. A higher wisdom, deep wisdom.
Yeah.
Is that, was Venerable Sāriputta able to see that wisdom by penetrating the jhana itself? Was it because he was already a stream enterer, or any lay person could analyze the jhana in this fashion by kind of looking back on his mind itself and seeing the dissolving nature of this mind content?
I would say that it doesn't depend upon prior attainment of any, stage of realization. It doesn't depend on the attainment of stream entry. Maybe because Sāriputta was a stream enterer, and even by his own nature, he already had very highly developed faculty of wisdom, so he was able to see, to dissect the experience of jhana in such, fine detail. But the ability to see the arising and the passing away of the jhanic factors wouldn't require prior attainment of a stage like stream entry. It would require just a very, very strong development of, I would say, of mindfulness and clear comprehension of sati sampajanya. Okay, 232, we've already done. Even if jhana is not necessary to attain stream entry, the jhanas are still mandatory for full liberation, correct? Again, these are sort of controversial questions. There are some suttas which describe the movement to arahantship, or full liberation, and whenever they're expounded by explaining first that the meditator enters the jhana, then he contemplates the jhana with insight, and then through contemplating the jhana with insight, he attains arahantship, or sometimes the stage of non-returner. Then there's one sutta which we discussed maybe last year, number 64 in the Majjhima Nikāya, where the Buddha says, this is the path to eliminating the 5 lower fetters, and it's impossible to eliminate the 5 lower fetters without taking this path. And when the Buddha expounds this, he goes through the jhanas, and with each jhana, the monk contemplates the factors of the jhana as basically impermanent, suffering, non-self, and then reaches either arahantship or non-returning. So if one takes those suttas as one's authority, then one says, sometimes a bit dogmatically, it's necessary to achieve jhana in order to gain arahantship. But then there's a sutta like the Satipatthana Sutta, in which jhana doesn't seem to play a particularly important role at all, even if it doesn't even seem to be necessary. And on the basis of the Satipatthana Sutta, the Buddha says, if one practices like this for 7 years, actually from 7 days down to 7 years, I guarantee you one of 2 results, either arahantship or non-returning. So it seems to me that the suttas are not unequivocal, not unanimous, but there may be different voices or different ways of looking at the issue. And so I hesitate to make pronouncements that this is absolutely mandatory. What we could say is mandatory for full liberation is insight into impermanent suffering non-self. Of course, if one gains jhana and then bases the insight on the jhana, probably it will be much smoother road. But it's also possible that just by following the method of the Satipatthana Sutta very rigorously, one could go through all of the stages of insight and come out to arahantship without jhana. Then, next question. Does the canon ever classify the mind consciousness as active doer, passive knower? Apply and sustain thoughts a still function of the doer component? No, I don't recall any distinction in mind consciousness between active doer and passive knower. Maybe somebody else knows a passage like that, but it doesn't come to my mind.
I think that's a distinction that John Kabat-Zinn tends to make. The knowing and being, or doing and being mode. But I don't think it's, I don't know if there's a sutta.
Anyway, I don't recall anything like that from the suttas. Okay.
Yeah, so back to that insight practice, the case of the dry insight practitioners.
Yeah.
So what Venerable Gururat Tana said that there's a kind of concentration called momentary concentration.
Yeah.
Is this some kind of special jhana aside from the classic jhanas described in the suttas? The momentary concentration.
Okay, momentary concentration, the expression is used in two senses. One is, as one is approaching towards jhana, then it's just a moment of, well, we say a moment of samadhi in which the five hindrances subside and the mind becomes fixed upon the object, but one comes out of it after a moment. So that's momentary concentration in relation to the samatha or serenity mode of meditation. Now, in relation to insight meditation, momentary concentration has a somewhat different meaning. This is the kind of concentration that arises from mindfully attending to the different objects of experience that arise moment after moment when one is doing insight meditation. So as one is attending to each object that arises, whether it be bodily phenomena, mental phenomena, one is making the mental note of that phenomena. And as one is doing so, the mind is becoming more and more focused upon the changing stream of experience. And so whatever arises from moment to moment is being noted, being observed. And so in this way, the mind enters into a state of concentration on the ever-changing flux of experience, so that it's always noting every object, always aware of every object. And so it's a state of samadhi, which is somewhat similar to what is called access concentration, the concentration approaching the jhana. But because the object is always changing from moment to moment, it doesn't become a fixed concentration, like the concentration in serenity meditation. And so it's not that one is just concentrated for a moment and then the mind becomes distracted, but the mind is continuously concentrated, but it's concentrated on an object or on a stream of objects that are always changing. And so because the object is different from moment to moment, it's called momentary concentration.
So is it safe to say that for the momentary concentration of the insight route, the first four jhana factors are present, but not the fifth one? The fifth one is the single-mindedness.
Even single-mindedness, one could say, is present. One-pointedness of mind is present. Because the mind is fixed one-pointedly on whatever object is present. But it's just that, unlike in samadhi meditation it's the same object. The breath, or actually it's the sign that arises based on the breath. Or it could be this kasina, the colored disc. So it's always the same object. But in the momentary concentration, it's always a changing object. But the mind is fixed one-pointedly upon that object, whatever it is. So all five of the jhana factors are present. But because the object is ever changing, the concentration doesn't reach the steadiness or depth of the jhana concentration.
Bhante, earlier you mentioned that there is a way that one could keep, disengaging or letting go, letting go whatever that comes, and then there is a deep concentration or deep state. So that sounds to me very interesting, because the mind is always, it needs something to put its step on. Now, but you are saying there is a way to keep taking whatever where it puts the foot, you keep taking that away. You keep taking away where it wants to get established. And yet you were able to, or rather, a person is able to reach a deep samadhi state. So what is that samadhi state?
I don't know a name for it. And maybe there are different samadhi states depending upon the exact way in which one goes about this process. There is a samadhi which is referred to in the suttas and never clearly explained, which is called the signless concentration, animitta samadhi. Perhaps this is the animitta samadhi.
But animitta, that's like three. Is that the same as the way one gets to the way? Okay, what I've heard is one can access nibbana through three directions.
Yeah, there's something called the three doors to deliverance.
Yeah, is that the same as the animitta samadhi or something else?
To my knowledge, or to my recollection, the expression animitta samadhi is not always used in that context. Sometimes it occurs independent of that context. The expression does occur in relation to the three, what later comes to be called the three doors to deliverance. This is the door of the signless samadhi, emptiness samadhi, and desireless samadhi, which again are not actually explained clearly in the suttas. It's only, I think, in the works like Visuddhimagga and commentaries that they're explained as the stage of samadhi that occurs through insight, directly preceding the entrance to the supramundane path. But in the suttas, they're just left unexplained. Okay, when I say that one can enter into a kind of samadhi just by letting go whatever arises, I'm not saying that the mind doesn't have any object at all, because technically the mind has to have some object. There has to be some object of awareness. It's just that this approach to samadhi doesn't involve fixing the mind upon one single object, like the breath, or a kasina object, or the bodily sensations, or whatever. But well, the way I've done this is just to focus on the mind itself, and then whatever arises, one just lets it go, lets it go, lets it go, without sort of fixing onto anything that arises. And at a certain point, it seems that all the content of the mind which has been arising just sort of breaks off or settles down, and then there's just a kind of clear awareness without, a fixed object of awareness. So there has to be some object. So what I would say is that it could be just maybe the luminous nature of the mind itself, or just awareness itself as the object.
So then, Bhante, does that consciousness, unestablished consciousness or something that you mentioned, what is that? Is that connected to?
The unestablished consciousness.
It's you mentioned it appears in Majjhima Nikāya at one place.
Oh, this is Vijñānaṃ Anidasanam.
Anidasana Vijñāna, Bhante.
Ananto Sabato Pabhang. Okay, Vijñānaṃ Anidasanam, consciousness, which is Anidasana, again, different interpretations of that. I'll explain my interpretation. Vijñānaṃ Anidasanam, Anantang, boundless, infinite, Anantang, Sabato Pabhang, luminous on all sides. Okay, I understand this to be Vijñānaṃ Anidasanam. I take Anidasana, I would translate it non-manifesting. And so then the question comes up, what is this consciousness? The Buddha says that no conditioned object gets a foothold in that kind of consciousness. I take that to be, this is a rather technical concept, but I take that to be the consciousness of the arahat in what's called the attainment of fruition. That's a special meditative attainment that the arahat enters, in which he is experiencing nibbana. And so that consciousness is not nibbana itself. So some interpreters, some commentators, or modern writers take that consciousness to be nibbana. And so they say nibbana is a kind of consciousness. But I take that consciousness not to be identical with nibbana, but it is the consciousness of the arhat when he's in the special meditative absorption in which he's experiencing nibbana. And it's called non-anidasana, non-manifesting, because it doesn't manifest any of the conditioned phenomena of the world. And I think one finds that state of consciousness described in a number of suttas towards the end of the Anguttara Nikāya, Book of Tens, maybe around the first chapter of the Book of Tens, and the Book of Elevens, the first chapter. It's within the first 10 suttas in the Book of Tens, Book of Elevens. And so Ananda comes to the Buddha and says, is it possible, O Bhante, for a monk to achieve such a state of samadhi in which he is not aware of earth, water, fire, and wind, not aware of the base of infinite space, infinite consciousness, base of nothingness, base of neither perception nor non-perception, not aware of this world, not aware of the world beyond, and yet he is still aware. And then the Buddha says, there is Ananda. So the Buddha says, there is Ananda, and how is there such a state of samadhi? Here the monk is conscious thus. This is the peaceful, this is the sublime, that is the stilling of all conditioned phenomena, sabba sankhara samato, sabbupati pati nisago, the relinquishing of all bases of attachment, dispassion, cessation, nibbana. And that is how the monk enters that samadhi. So I take that, the mind in that samadhi, to be the consciousness which is anidasanang anantang sabbato babang, which is non-manifesting, boundless, luminous on all sides.
And animitta samadhi you mentioned is different or the same?
As I said, the animitta samadhi is not so, it's not explicitly defined in the suttas. It's just, actually there is a way that is characterized, but it's not, I think it's in sutta number 43, where it's called actually the signless liberation. Okay, it's on page 393, paragraph 27. This is a conversation between Sāriputta and another monk, Mahakotita. I think Mahakotita is asking questions to Sāriputta, so he says, how many conditions are there for the attainment of the signless deliverance of mind? The Sāriputta says there are two conditions for the attainment of the signless deliverance of mind. One is non-attention to all, here it's called signs, nimitta, you could say objects, and attention to the signless element. These are the two conditions for the attainment of the signless deliverance of mind. What is the signless element? There's a note, let's see. Then the note says, this is the attainment of fruition. The signs are objects such as forms, etc. And the signless element is nibbana, in which all the signs of conditioned things are absent. Okay, maybe we take one more question then. Well, I saw two hands go up, so we'll take this gentleman here and then... You are Hong, is that your name? Okay. If you would take the microphone, it would help with the recording.
I want to ask, I guess one a simple question and one maybe a more complex, but simple question is, what was the sutta's number for the Buddha's and Sāriputta's first encounter when Sāriputta goes to the Buddha that you described?
It comes in the Vinaya Pitaka, the book of discipline. It's one of the books of the Vinaya Pitaka is called the Mahavagga. But you'll find the same, you'll find that account. This is not a plug for promotion but there's a book called Great Disciples of the Buddha.
Yes.
Of course you don't need the whole Mahavagga of the Vinaya Pitaka, which goes into a lot of detail of monastic regulations. Yes. But you get, that story has been included in the book, a paperback. It's called The Great Disciples of the Buddha.
Yes.
One chapter is the life of Sāriputta, then it has the story of that incident.
I think that some of the confusion that this discussion reveals about jhana may be reduced by two considerations. To try, I hope this doesn't sound presumptuous. Hope this doesn't sound presumptuous. But to remember that the object under the Four Noble Truths, the second noble truth, to uproot craving.
Yeah.
And I think if we relate our meditation experience or attempts at meditation and how effective it is in uprooting the craving, then that will be the test, not which rarefied state we're in, but how effective it is for us in uprooting the craving. And then I would remind what I think of is the story of when Buddha points that when he stopped the terrible ascetic practices, he remembered the mind state of a child under the apple blossoms. And I would say that if we followed that example, it might be easier for us.
Yeah. So that experience under the rose apple tree was the experience of the first jhana.
Yes, but maybe think of the rose apple tree more than the jhana.
And I think Hong, so you'll get the last question.
Before my last question, I actually found the Anguttara reference. It's 10.6. And it says that that fruition attainment is not jhana-based nor formless attainment. It looks like some kind of heavy-duty, quite advanced stage.
Wait, it's referring to what?
The signless concentration state. And your footnote says, the attainment is not the fruition of what occurs for a few moments immediately following the path, but a special meditative state accessible only to those who have already attained one of the four paths and fruition. Looks like it's a quite advanced state of meditation. The attainment as shown in this sutta does not take any of the mundane conditioned meditation objects as its support. Its support is the unconditioned nibbana experienced directly and immediately. So it's quite heavy duty to me.
Okay, anyway, this is getting a little too rarefied for my...
Anyway, my last question would be regarding the stream enterer. They're defined as having at most 7 more lives.
Yeah.
But that shouldn't be unique to stream enterers, right?
But what?
The 7 more lives.
Yeah.
That should not be unique to stream enterers, right? Because the Dhammanusari, the truth follower and the faith followers.
Yeah.
The sutta said that they won't be able to pass away until they reach the fruit of stream entry right in the same lifetime.
Yeah.
So that means that truth followers and faith followers also have at most 7 more lives.
Yeah.
It's not exclusive to stream enterer.
Well, the thing is that they're going to, at the time of their death, they're going to be stream enterers. So from looking at it from the point of view of how many lives you get after you die, then there's 7 more.
But is it always true that truth follower and faith followers, they always attain stream entry in the same lifetime?
Yeah, that's what's said in the sutta.
Okay. Thus, they also have 7 more lives.
Yeah, you could say that, yeah. Okay, then I think we'll stop for the day. Wow, it's 1:15. This is... Since we started 12:25, this is quite I'll have to apply for overtime. No, overtime! We have to form a union. Okay, we end with 3 bows. Okay. 1. Okay, thank you for your patience under these trying conditions of having to move from our regular home.